As the climate is changing, it's shifting the locations of where plants and animals can live. And so what we're seeing is something actually pretty simple, that plants and animals in the oceans, on land, everywhere, are shifting towards the poles, up the mountains, and to deeper waters in the ocean to try to track the climate as it's shifting around the world. So my own study organisms is butterflies, and they're very sensitive to climate. But really we needed to know, is it affecting not just the most sensitive, is climate change affecting not just the most sensitive species, but how is wildlife and plant life in general being affected? So that drove me to do these really huge global meta-analyses where we put in all the data from all organisms that we have long-term data on, and then we filter it to try to take out the impacts of other human activities. So we try to try to filter out impacts of habitat destruction and pollution and invasive species, all these things that we know are changing how and when plants and animals live, so that we get down to really what's just climate change doing. And when we do that, when we get down to organisms living in fairly natural areas, undisturbed areas, what's happening there, what we're seeing is that spring is earlier, plants and animals are coming out earlier from wintertime, they're migrating earlier, they're breeding earlier, and we're seeing that in the oceans as well as on the land. And we're also seeing that about half of all species, whether it's in the oceans, on land, in lakes, is shifting to live closer to the poles and further up the mountains or deeper into the ocean, tracking climate as the climate shifts around the globe. And that the way in which they're moving and the way in which spring and fall events are changing are really, we can nail it down to a diagnostic pattern that's really could only be caused by climate change, and not by habitat loss, and not by pollution, and not by all the other things that humans are doing. So that's what's meant by a fingerprint of climate change. It's looking at these global long-term observations, filtering out changes that we know could be due from all kinds of other human activities, and really nailing down what's left is what's caused by climate change. So what we mean by looking for a fingerprint of climate change impacts is looking for changes that are such that nothing else but climate change could be causing them. And one of those is when you look at species shifting their ranges, say northward in Europe, what you're seeing is that shift is by populations going extinct down at the southern range in Spain or northern Africa, and at the northern edge in Scandinavia, they're actually colonizing further north. And that specific pattern is not what you'd expect from land use changes occurring in the north and in the south, or habitat destruction or pollution. It's a fingerprint specifically of what we expect climate change to be causing. So climate change is driving these northward range shifts. We're seeing half of all species shifting their ranges towards the poles and up the mountains. Conservation biologists are used to thinking of protecting nature as you set up a boundary and you keep everything inside in a healthy state and undisturbed, and you don't allow anything to be built, and that protects biodiversity, sort of putting a fence up and holding things in and keeping humans from mucking around too much. But with climate change, those protected areas are no longer going to be able to protect the species that we set them up for, because those species are going to moving out, and new species are going to be moving in as climate tracks around the globe. So our very concept of what it means to conserve nature has to change. We have to be more flexible. We have to think more dynamically that things are moving, things will move out, but also into protected areas. We have to create corridors to allow the wild species to move more freely, to track the climate as it's shifting. And we need to be thinking more broadly. Instead of thinking of protecting individual species, we need to think about protecting biodiversity at the global scale. So really thinking out of the box. And we're going to lose some species, and we need to be aware of that. I mean, personally, I don't think the polar bear is going to survive. It pains me, but I don't think we should be putting a lot of effort into preserving species that are bound to fail, but we need to help them to perhaps hybridize with other species, let the polar bear hybridize with the grizzly bear, and hopefully keep those genes into the pool, the genetic pool of biodiversity, so that as climate stabilizes and hopefully cools down again, then we can have these cold-adapted species re-emerge. So the whole way we think about biodiversity preservation is really fundamentally changing with climate change.